Welcome to Art of Citizenry, the podcast where we unpack the systemic power structures that have shaped culture, economics, politics, and policy as we know it today. I'm Manpreet Kaur Kalra, and today we're talking about cultural humility. I really appreciate you being here and joining me for this conversation. This episode holds a special place in my heart. It's an episode I've been wanting to do since I started the podcast almost 5 years ago. If you've listened to some of the early episodes of this podcast or attended any of my keynotes or workshops, you know that cultural humility as a framework has grounded my work for years now. I incorporate it into almost every one of my talks because it offers a perspective that challenges the very colonial worldview that knowledge transcends or does not require lived experience. In other words, it challenges the false notion that you can simply learn enough about another culture to truly understand it. Having spent my share in the social impact space, I've seen this problematic worldview time and time again. People from the global north, or rather the global minority, travel to countries of the global south and immerse themselves in the diversity of cultures of those of the global majority. Whether it's 6 months or 6 years, it's impossible to say you fully understand the nuances of another's experience. You cannot become the expert of a culture. Culture is dynamic. It is evolving and experienced differently, depending on individuals' intersectional identities, both the way in which we wield and yield power. As a Punjabi Sikh woman in the diaspora, my experience is different from every other woman who share the same general profile as myself. That is intersectionality at its core. We each ride the waves of our advantages and disadvantages. The power and privileges we hold are fluid. They ebb and flow depending on context and environment. How we each navigate the world is different. Our privilege is the way in which we hold advantage when navigating an unequal system. Power and privilege are intersectional and incredibly personal. In some instances, we may carry privilege, while in others, we do not. I think about the way we approach difference, how we hold space for others, how we listen, how we move through the world that is complex, nuanced, and unequal by design. Cultural humility is not about mastering diversity like an equation to be solved. It's not a checklist of cultural facts or a certificate of competency. Cultural humility is a practice, an ongoing process of self-reflection, of unlearning and relearning, of recognizing that no matter how much we think we know, we are always students of the human experience. It requires us to interrogate our own biases, to sit with the discomfort of not having all the answers, and most importantly, to be willing to be changed by the perspectives, experiences, and truths of others. Cultural humility is the practice of approaching others with openness, respect, and a willingness to learn. Recognizing that our own perspectives are limited and shaped by our unique lived experiences. Unlike cultural competence, which implies a static mastery of another culture, cultural humility acknowledges that understanding is an ongoing process. It is about building relationships rooted in mutual respect, co-creating solutions, and constantly questioning and challenging our own biases. In other words, it's less about helping and more about listening and learning. Having cultural humility requires one to reject the assumption that they know the answer to every problem faced by communities other than their own. Cultural humility means putting any preconceived notions aside and letting others tell their own story and lead the conversation. It encourages us to be students, holding no assumptions, judgments, or prejudice while interacting with others. It also challenges us, regardless of the relationships we navigate and the titles we hold, to realize that we have a limited understanding of the cultures we engage with as outsiders. And right now, in this moment, cultural humility is more important than ever. We are living in a time of polarization where ideological echo chambers are fortified by algorithms. Conversations too often collapse into debates, and the impulse to be right overweighs our responsibility to listen. In this climate, cultural humility becomes a radical act. It asks us to resist the urge to be an expert on others' lived experiences. It calls on us to acknowledge the power structures that shape our world and our place within it. And it challenges us to move beyond performative allyship toward meaningful solidarity. The concept of cultural humility emerged in the 1990s in the global health space. It was introduced by Dr. Melanie Tervalon and Dr. Jan Marie Garcia as a critique of cultural competency training, which was widely used in medical education at the time. Cultural competency, while well-intentioned, framed culture as something that could be learned or mastered, implying that healthcare professionals could acquire a finite set of knowledge about different cultural groups and then provide culturally competent care. But this approach overlooked the complexities that concepts such as intersectionality honor, identity, power, and structural inequalities. Tervalon and Murray Garcia argue that no one can ever be fully competent in another's culture. Instead, they proposed cultural humility, a lifelong process of self-reflection, learning, and power analysis that acknowledges the limits of one's knowledge. Cultural humility shifts the focus from acquiring expertise to nurturing genuine, equitable relationships, recognizing that only those who have lived through a particular experience firsthand hold the deepest knowledge of their own lived experience. Makes sense. At the heart of many well-intentioned efforts is the desire to make a positive difference. But without cultural humility, even the best intentions can result in harm. Take, for instance, development projects that impose solutions without truly understanding local contexts. A well-documented example is the play pump, a water pump designed as a merry-go-round. It was celebrated as an innovative way to provide clean water to communities in sub-Saharan Africa. In its idealistic conception, 3 problems were to be solved simultaneously by the play pump. Women having to work hard every time they pump water, girls staying away from school to help their mothers fetch water, and children having no playground. But in reality, the pump was dependent on children constantly playing for 24 hours a day in order to deliver the water quantity it promised and that was required by the communities, all while blurring the lines between child labor and child play. When children weren't around, women were operating the merry-go-round manually, working hard to pump up water that would have been otherwise surfaced much more easily with a traditional hand pump. Similarly, Tom's Shoes' buy one, give one model disrupted local economies in countries such as Haiti by flooding markets with free shoes and undermining local shoemakers and businesses. This ultimately created more economic instability. The moral of the story is, good intentions don't necessarily translate to good outcomes. The unintentional consequences of doing good without collaborative, community-driven approaches can easily harm the very communities folks are trying to help. By practicing cultural humility, we move away from paternalistic approaches to social impact and toward a model that centers the voices and agency of communities. Over the years, I've attended and spoken at numerous conferences on ethical sourcing and labor rights. As someone deeply committed to addressing the human rights harms embedded in global supply chains, ethical, sustainable, and fair trade spaces have always had a special place and a central place in my work. But my relationship with these spaces has evolved. When I attended my first fair trade conference, I was your classic heropreneur, someone who was eager, idealistic, and convinced that the answer to global inequalities was responsible business. As someone who had spent her early career working in tech while using my free time on passion projects that centered around intersectional feminism and social justice, I was ready to make my passion for doing good the center of my work. After doing some research and learning about the ways impact-driven businesses in the global north were engaging with communities in the global south to build capacity and opportunities through business, I knew I wanted to do something similar, but particularly for the community I felt most connected to, women in Punjab, my ancestral homeland. Like many other heropreneurs, I decided to travel abroad, in my case Punjab, for 2 months, and meet with artisans to start my own social enterprise. Now, to understand the nuance in my story, I need to start by acknowledging my own limitations. Growing up in the diaspora, even though I speak Punjabi and am connected to my cultural heritage, that does not mean I truly understand the challenges, needs, and lived experiences of artisan women living in Punjab. This distinction was something I really had to confront. I was a guest here. I also somehow believed I could use the same cookie-cutter approach to ethical business used by other companies in the context I was entering. This flawed belief that the same model can work in various cultural and social contexts is inherently reductive and often harmful. What my myopic view neglected to appreciate was the systemic issues at play. Camera in hand, I was ready to document every detail about their personal lives. I now realize I went in with my own subconscious agenda, this very human urge to satisfy my own discontent with inequalities, to help, to not take my privilege for granted. Assuming that I somehow had the answer to an issue that was so complex is incredibly naive in retrospect. And as much as it's hard to admit, that experience was more about satisfying my own need to be helpful versus the needs of others. I focused on the facts that made me feel like my work was relevant and important, facts that made me believe that these women needed my help. I was so fixated on economic empowerment that I failed to acknowledge the many ways these women, these artisans, these creatives were already empowering themselves and each other without my existence. It wasn't till much later that I paused and reflected, what do the communities I spent the last 2 months meeting with actually need? And what role do I actually play, if any? The answer, I would later realize, isn't always entrepreneurship. It also isn't always economic opportunity. Yet my brain had been conditioned to assume that financial capital was the primary solution to systemic injustices. I never stopped to interrogate where that assumption came from or whose interests it ultimately served. I'd approached impact through a lens that centered my own framework of progress without ever questioning whether it aligned with the realities and aspirations of the people I claimed to support. That realization reshaped the way I engage with ethical trade spaces today. Because real impact isn't about imposing solutions. It's about listening, learning, and dismantling the very narratives that have led so many do-gooders to believe we have the answers in the first place. We must reflect and confront the very real question that plagues so many spaces. Who decides what a community needs? That experience for me was a lesson in cultural humility. It highlighted how easy it is to assume expertise while overlooking the voices of those most affected. Despite the best of intentions, my approach centered existing industry practices around economic development rather than direct engagement with the workers whose lives I was entering as an outsider. Communities at the center of an issue or project should be the ones driving the solutions. Solutions that do-gooders with more privilege and/or access should resource, not necessarily co-opt. In our last episode, Maru of La Resistencia talked about the importance of those most impacted by immigration policy and detention shaping activism and grassroots efforts. This example is more forthright. In an environment where migrants are literally being caged and sequestered from the public, only they can speak to the experience that U.S. systems of oppression and force are imposing on them. We should center the voices of detained migrants in advocating for immigration justice. However, this is a framework we should apply in all other contexts, wherein a privileged minority is entering an issue they have been relatively immune to. In social impact and global development spaces, the act of diagnosing something as an issue to be solved is often preemptive and deeply rooted in colonial frameworks of intervention. It assumes that communities lack agency, framing them as passive recipients of aid rather than active participants in shaping their own futures. This prescriptive approach is driven by external perceptions of need rather than lived realities, frequently overlooking indigenous knowledge systems, local governance structures, and self-determined pathways for progress. By positioning certain conditions, whether informal economies or cultural practices, as inherently problematic, development actors risk imposing solutions that reflect Western ideals as progress that anchor on GDP or economic utility rather than responding to the nuanced, context-specific aspirations of the communities they aim to support. In doing so, they replicate colonial patterns of control, where interventions are legitimized not by the needs expressed by those affected, but by the assumptions and desires of those who hold power. True social impact requires shifting from problem solving to deep listening, recognizing that communities are not problems to be fixed, but sovereign entities with the right to define their own trajectories. This is why cultural humility is important. It reminds us that conventionally designed expertise and authority do not always equate to understanding. It urges us to shift from a mindset of knowing to one of learning and unlearning. It teaches us that true allyship requires listening, not assuming. Co-creation is a powerful tool that is underutilized in most spaces. But before we can begin the co-creation process, it is important to acknowledge and recognize power dynamics. This allows us to actively work to reset the conversation, dismantle the systems we are operating in, and create space for genuine collaboration that is authentically valuable to all. Know the power and privilege you hold. We are living in an era where conversations about race, identity, gender, and justice are more critical than ever, yet they are often met with defensiveness, dismissal, or outrage. Cultural humility offers a path forward, not by demanding that we all agree, but by challenging us to remain open, to listen deeply, and to acknowledge the limitations of our perspectives. Polarization thrives on certainty, the belief that we fully understand an issue, that others just need to be educated or corrected. Cultural humility resists that certainty. It encourages us to hold space for complexity and contradiction, to center the voices of communities and individuals most impacted, allowing them to guide the conversation. It reminds us that learning is not a destination, but a process, and that our understanding of others will always be incomplete. It also challenges us to examine the structures and histories that shape our perspectives. Cultural humility is not just about personal attitudes. It's about recognizing systemic inequalities and being willing to change the institutions and norms that uphold them. Whether we are educators, policymakers, business leaders, or activists, cultural humility asks us to move beyond symbolic gestures and towards substantive change. So how do we integrate cultural humility into our work, our communities, and the spaces we influence? There's 3 things I think about that I think would be helpful for you as well. 1, deep listening. Before assuming what a community needs, take the time to truly listen. This means engaging in conversations, asking open-ended questions, and valuing lived experiences over theoretical frameworks. Remember, communities are the experts of their own realities. Number 2, reflection. Cultural humility requires us to confront our own assumptions and privileges. Reflect on questions like, what biases am I bringing to this work? How might my positionality, whether it's my nationality, education, socioeconomic status, affect how I approach this community? Recognize the ways in which power is distributed and challenge the hierarchies that exclude or silence others. Number 3, co-creation. True impact is co-created. Rather than designing a project in isolation, collaborate with community members from the onset. This ensures the solutions are not only culturally relevant, but also sustainable and empowering. Cultural humility is not an end goal. It is not a static achievement. It's an invitation to move through the world with curiosity, with accountability, and with a deep respect for the dignity of others. It is an acknowledgement that no matter how much we learn, we will always have more to learn. And in a time when certainty feels easier than curiosity, when division feels easier than dialogue, and when being right feels more urgent than being kind, cultural humility is not just a framework, it's a necessity. As you reflect on this episode, I invite you to consider how you are practicing cultural humility in your own work. Whether you're volunteering, building a social enterprise, or simply engaging in conversations, take a step back and ask, am I truly listening? Am I making space for other voices? Am I willing to unlearn? With that, I want to thank you all for tuning in. This podcast is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Let's remember that social good is not about saving others. It's about joining in solidarity and co-creating a just and equitable world. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Noah Kowalski. Our theme music was created by Katrina Zemrak.